Buried deep in the heart of winter, a lone prospector's ingenuity and resilience were tested against the merciless cold of the mountains. His creation, an almost impenetrable snow dome cabin, became his sanctuary during the brutal whiteout nights that stretched into eternity. But what was it about this humble structure that kept him alive when others would have perished? Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from. If you're fascinated by survival stories from the frontier, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode uncovers even more incredible feats from history. The wind howled like a living creature outside the small dome-shaped cabin, sweeping across the snow-covered plains with fury. Inside, Elias Bennett, a weathered prospector, stood at the edge of the fireplace, his eyes scanning the flickering shadows. The temperature had plummeted below 0 hours ago, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The air inside the cabin, however, felt warm and comforting despite the bitter winds outside. Elias had been living alone in these mountains for 3 winters, but this one was different. The storms were unrelenting, and it felt as if the world had been swallowed by a blinding white fog, erasing all paths to safety. But his snow dome cabin, a creation born out of necessity and stubborn pride, stood strong. The thick walls of packed snow, reinforced by timber beams and a unique design, kept the cabin warmer than any structure he'd ever built. He moved slowly as his stiff joints protested from the months of isolation. His fur-lined boots, worn and cracked from the harsh conditions, sank slightly into the snow-covered floor. Elias adjusted his heavy coat, the fur lining keeping the worst of the chill at bay. But the cold was always present, just under the surface. He wasn't naive enough to believe the storm would pass quickly. This was nature's way of testing his resolve. Elias looked toward the small wooden window, its panes frosted from the inside. He couldn't see much beyond the swirling snow, but he didn't need to. He had lived in these mountains long enough to know when a storm would turn into a true whiteout, and this one was far from over. He had already been snowed in for over a week, with no sign of relief. The fire crackled beside him, casting long shadows against the walls of the cabin. His only companion was the faint scent of burning pine and the rhythmic ticking of his old clock. The cabin had been a dream, a vision he'd had in the moments of clarity after a near-death experience during his first winter alone. He knew the dangers of the snowstorms too well, how quickly the weather could turn from manageable to life-threatening. It had been that exact moment, lying in a snowbank after losing track of his trail, that Elias knew he had to build something different if he ever intended to survive in these brutal conditions. His idea was simple, but radical for the time. Instead of building a conventional log cabin, which would have been vulnerable to both the weather and wild animals, he would create a structure that would take advantage of nature itself. A dome-shaped building, insulated by snow, compact yet strong enough to withstand the worst of the mountain storms. His snow dome cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress against nature's fury. Elias took a deep breath and ran a hand over his rugged beard, still shocked by the simplicity of his solution. It wasn't the work of an engineer or a builder, just a man who understood that sometimes survival wasn't about battling nature head-on. Sometimes it was about working with it. As the storm raged on, Elias huddled in his cabin, the warmth from the fire and the solid walls around him providing a brief but precious sense of security. But the storm outside wasn't done yet. It would take more than his ingenuity to survive the night. The snow continued to fall heavily, blanketing the mountain in an endless sea of white. Each new gust of wind slammed against the snow-dome cabin, but Elias didn't flinch. The structure groaned slightly under the pressure of the wind, but the thick snow walls, packed tightly and reinforced with sturdy timber, held strong. He had built it to endure. The cabin had taken 2 long summers to complete, a project that had pushed Elias to his limits. Most prospectors would have called him mad to spend so much time on something so extravagant, but to Elias it was a matter of life and death. His previous winters in the mountains had been marked by close calls, Snowstorms that had caught him off guard, nights spent huddling in a half-finished shelter with his breath visible in the cold air. He couldn't afford another mistake. He couldn't afford another winter of fear. Elias walked across the floor of his cabin, feeling the warmth seep through the soles of his boots. The floor, made from layered logs and packed snow, provided insulation against the freezing ground beneath. The air inside felt thick and heavy with the heat from the fire, but it was still bearable. A steady fire was key to surviving the brutal cold, and he had learned to make it last with minimal wood. The stove, built from an old cast-iron pot, was simple but efficient, funneling the heat throughout the cabin. It wasn't just the fire that kept the cabin warm, though. The snow walls, although deceptive in their fragile appearance, created an insulating effect that worked like a natural heater. Snow, packed tightly, trapped heat within the cabin, keeping the interior several degrees warmer than it was outside. The dome shape allowed the wind to pass around the cabin, not pushing against flat walls that would have buckled under pressure. It was a design born from his understanding of nature, a perfect marriage of engineering and the natural world. As he checked the fire once more, Elias thought about how far he had come. The decision to build the snow dome cabin had been born from a tragedy. The previous winter, a close friend had perished in a snowstorm after their shelter collapsed under the weight of the snow. The harsh reality of mountain life hit hard that year. Life was fragile, and one mistake could cost you everything. He had lost friends, made mistakes, and nearly lost his own life. But now, with his snow dome standing strong in the face of the storm, he felt something else. Hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found a way to conquer the wild. Outside, the storm howled, but inside, Elias was warm, secure, and alive. And for now, that was enough. The wind screamed against the walls of the snow dome cabin, its howl rising in volume as the storm grew more ferocious. Elias sat in the center of his cabin, his back pressed against the rough-hewn timber walls. The fire crackled in the corner, but it wasn't enough to drown out the violent force of the snowstorm outside. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The first night alone in the dome with nothing to rely on but his own survival instincts. The cold was creeping in, inching through the cracks of the doorframe and seeping into the very bones of the structure. But despite the chill, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. He had designed the cabin to withstand the worst conditions, and for the first time he was seeing the results of his labor. As the wind howled outside, Elias was warm, he was safe. His thoughts drifted to his earlier years in the mountains, when he had first arrived as an eager prospector, full of dreams and ambition. Back then, his shelter had been makeshift, improvised with little more than tarps, logs, and luck. He had learned quickly that in these mountains, luck didn't always favor the prepared. The harsh winters, the unpredictable storms, the wildlife. Everything here had a way of humbling even the most confident of men. Now, in this snow dome cabin, Elias was a different man. The walls, made of tightly packed snow, had taken the worst the storm could throw at them. They held their shape, never buckling under the pressure. The cabin's design was an innovation, built from his years of experience and observation. He had carefully selected the site for the cabin, a small rise above the valley floor that provided some protection from the wind, as well as a clear line of sight for spotting wildlife or approaching danger. Tonight, though, the danger was not external, it was internal. The isolation was a heavy weight that pressed down on Elias's chest, the silence in the cabin amplifying his every thought. The storm outside was a reminder of how fragile his existence was, how easy it would be for the world to swallow him whole. But as the hours dragged on and the storm raged, Elias found comfort in his creation. The snow walls didn't just block the wind, they shielded him from the darkness creeping inside. He checked the fire one last time before settling. Onto the small cot in the corner. The bed, made of rough woolen blankets and a layer of soft pine boughs, was more comfortable than he had expected. As his body began to relax, he realized just how exhausted he was. The constant strain of the past days, working to finish the cabin, gathering firewood, preparing for the winter storm, had taken its toll. His muscles ached, his bones felt heavy, and sleep, elusive for so long, now beckoned him. But before sleep could claim him, Elias thought about the future. This cabin was more than just shelter. It was his answer to a question that had haunted him for months. Could he survive in the wilderness, isolated from the rest of the world, without the comforts of society? The answer, he realized, was no longer a matter of whether he could survive. It was whether he could live. And as the storm howled outside and the warmth of the fire cradled him, Elias felt that for the first time he might truly find peace in the wilderness. The morning light came slowly, casting a pale glow across the thick blanket of snow that covered the land outside. Elias awoke with the sound of the storm still howling against the walls of the snow dome cabin. He had expected the wind to subside by morning, but the whiteout continued unabated, with no sign of relief. For a moment, Elias simply lay there, his mind foggy from sleep, his body stiff from the cold. But he knew the storm wouldn't wait for him to rest. Rising from the cot, Elias shuffled to the fire and stoked the embers back to life. The warmth from the flames was welcome, but he couldn't afford to waste time. He had no way of knowing when the storm would break, and he needed to keep his supplies in check. The food he had stored in the cabin was enough for a few weeks. But the more he stayed holed up in this tiny shelter, the faster his supplies would dwindle. And with the snow piled high outside, there was no guarantee he would be able to venture out to hunt or trap. Elias knew this test was just beginning. The cabin, though strong, was not invincible. It had been built for the storms, but the storm was a living, unpredictable force, one that could destroy even the most carefully constructed shelter if given enough time. The question wasn't whether the cabin could withstand the storm. It was whether Elias could outlast it. As the hours stretched on, Elias kept busy. He checked the fire, prepared the last of his dried meat, and sorted through his tools. Each movement was measured and deliberate, the quiet rhythm of survival taking over his mind. His world had shrunk to the size of the cabin and the storm outside, and there was something oddly comforting about the simplicity of it all. There was no need to think beyond the immediate. Survive, stay warm, and wait for the storm to pass. By mid-afternoon, Elias had finished his work, but the storm showed no sign of abating. The wind slammed against the snow walls, the sound of it so deafening at times that he couldn't hear the crackling of the fire. The dome shape of the cabin, which he had carefully designed to deflect the wind, seemed to be holding up well, but Elias wasn't foolish enough to think the storm wouldn't test its limits. Snow was accumulating on the roof, a thick blanket that pressed down on the structure, and while he had reinforced the roof with heavy timber, it was only a matter of time before the weight became too much. Elias stepped outside for a moment, braving the storm to check the surrounding area. The cold hit him like a wall, biting into his skin, but he had to know how much snow had accumulated. He struggled against the wind, his face shielded by a thick scarf, but even then the gusts cut through, freezing his breath before it could escape. The storm was far worse than he had anticipated. He couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him, the snow whipping around like a blur of white. After only a few minutes, he turned back toward the cabin, his progress slow and careful. He had enough experience to know when to fight the storm and when to retreat. Inside, the warmth of the fire greeted him like an old friend. It was a small comfort, but it was enough. Elias sat down by the fire, pulling his coat tighter around his body, his mind racing. The storm was a test of endurance, and it wasn't over yet. The snow dome cabin had passed the first test, but he knew the coming days would be even harder. As the snow piled higher and the wind howled louder, Elias could only wait, his thoughts turning to the future, to what would come after the storm. Would he be able to survive in this isolation, or would the storm claim him as it had claimed so many before? For now, all he could do was wait and endure. The days began to bleed into one another as the storm raged on, its relentless fury trapping Elias in the small confines of the snow-dome cabin. He had lost count of how many nights had passed since the first flakes had fallen, how many times the wind had howled, shaking the structure like a fragile reed in a storm. The outside world had disappeared beneath layers of snow and wind, a white, suffocating void that kept Elias locked in his cabin with only his thoughts for company. The isolation was harder than he had expected. It was not the physical discomfort of the cold that weighed on him, but the oppressive silence. The days were long, stretching out like an endless horizon of emptiness. The fire in the corner was a small comfort, but the warmth it provided seemed to highlight the absence of life around him. The snow outside had become a constant, a reminder that the world was still moving, even if it was beyond his reach. As Elias sat by the fire, he thought about the people he had left behind. His decision to come to the mountains had been his own, a choice driven by a desire to escape the noise and chaos of civilization, to live a simpler life, to find peace in the wilderness. But now, in the thick of this solitude, Elias wondered if he had made a mistake. The mountains had become a place of quiet torment, where his only companions were the echo of his own thoughts and the occasional memory of better days. He often thought about the friends he had lost over the years, the ones who hadn't made it through the harsh winters, or those who had disappeared into the wilderness without a trace. Their faces seemed to fade in his memory, their voices growing quieter with each passing day. He wondered if they had felt the same way during their final moments, if they had, too, felt the crushing weight of solitude. But Elias had always prided himself on his independence. He had come to the mountains with the belief that he could survive alone, that he didn't need anyone else. Yet now, in the stillness of the cabin, he realized that survival was not just about food and shelter, it was about human connection. And in the absence of that connection, the mind began to unravel. A shift in the air outside caught his attention. He stood up quickly, his mind snapping back to the present. The wind had died down, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, the storm had quieted. Elias moved to the small window, peering out into the vast expanse of white. The sky was still overcast, but the swirling snow had finally ceased, leaving the landscape eerily calm. A small sense of relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. The storm was over for now, but the weight of solitude would remain, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Elias knew the storm was only the beginning. The real test would be the days to come, the days when the storm had passed, but the silence would continue to press in. He would have to find a way to live with it, to fill the emptiness with something other than the ghosts of his past. But for now, the silence was his only company. Elias woke to the sound of wind, soft but insistent, brushing against the walls of the snow-dome cabin. The storm had returned, though not with the same ferocity as before. It was a quieter storm this time, a subtle reminder that nature could not be tamed. Elias had hoped for a brief respite, but the mountains were relentless, and the storm's return felt like a personal challenge, testing his resolve once more. The cabin, though strong, had not been immune to the first wave of the storm. The snow had settled heavily on the roof, the weight pressing down on the structure, though Elias had made sure it was reinforced well enough to withstand the pressure. He had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, gathering extra supplies and ensuring that the snow dome would hold. But even with all his preparations, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains were watching him, testing his every decision. As Elias stoked the fire, he stared into the flames, feeling the weight of the storm outside pushing against the calm of the cabin. His thoughts drifted to the world beyond the snow, to the people he had left behind, to the life he had once known. The isolation had a way of making him feel disconnected from the world, as if he were a part of something much larger, something ancient, untouchable. He stepped outside, wrapped tightly in his thick coat, his breath forming clouds of steam in the frigid air. The world outside was a blur of white, the snow swirling in the wind like a living thing. He couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him, the storm blurring everything into one endless expanse of white. Elias trudged forward, his boots sinking into the deep snow. As he made his way to the edge of the cabin, he needed to check the snow buildup on the roof to ensure it wasn't getting too heavy. The wind cut through his layers of clothing, biting at his face, but Elias didn't mind. The cold had become familiar to him, something he could endure. What bothered him more was the constant presence of the storm, the feeling that he could never fully escape its grasp. Even in the quiet moments when the wind seemed to calm, there was a tension in the air, as if the storm were only biding its time before it struck again. After checking the roof, Elias retreated back into the cabin, his limbs stiff from the cold. He had learned to work quickly in these conditions, moving with purpose, making sure that each action was deliberate and efficient. Time in the mountains was different from the world he had left behind. It was slower, but it was also more immediate, more real. There was no room for distractions here, no place for hesitation. Every decision mattered. Back inside, Elias set to work gathering wood for the fire. The small, constant tasks of survival, tending to the fire, checking the cabin, preparing his meals, had become his routine. It was the rhythm of life in the wilderness, a life that demanded patience and endurance. As the storm raged outside, Elias knew that he would face more challenges ahead, but for now the cabin held strong, and he had a fire to keep him warm. The storm had returned, but so had Elias's determination. The mountain might be relentless, but so was he. The storm had passed, but the mountains remained in a state of tense calm. The days blended together in a quiet rhythm, with Elias falling into the daily routine of maintaining the fire, checking the cabin, and making sure his supplies were well stocked. The weather outside had mellowed, though the winds still whispered through the trees like a distant warning. But it wasn't the weather that Elias now feared. It was the unseen threat lurking just beyond the reach of his cabin. As he worked outside, clearing a path through the snow to gather firewood, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't a tangible threat, not in the way a bear or a wolf might present itself. No, this was something more subtle, a sense that something out there was aware of him, waiting. The mountains were full of dangers, but for the first time, Elias felt that the wilderness itself had turned against him. He paused in his tracks, staring out at the landscape. The trees stood silent, their branches heavy with snow, and the air was still, eerily quiet. But there was something wrong, something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual sense of solitude that he had grown accustomed to. No, this felt different. It felt like an invitation to something dangerous, something that was already circling the edges of his world. Elias shook off the feeling, telling himself that it was just the isolation getting to him. He had spent too many days alone, too many nights, listening to the wind howl and the snow drift outside, but deep down he knew better. The mountains had a way of revealing their secrets slowly, and Elias had learned to listen to the quiet murmurs of the wilderness. It was not in the roar of the storm or the rattle of the trees that the true danger lay. It was in the silence, the waiting. He returned to the cabin and stoked the fire, the warmth from the flames comforting him for a moment, but not enough to ease the growing unease in his gut. The storm had passed, but the danger had not. Elias had lived in these mountains long enough to know that the wilderness was never truly quiet. It was always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, as Elias lay in his cot, the wind picked up again, howling outside like a restless spirit. He couldn't sleep, the feeling of being watched settling over him like a heavy cloak. The walls of the snow dome cabin, which had once felt like a fortress, now seemed fragile. He had built this place to withstand the storm, to keep out the cold and the bears, but he hadn't accounted for the quiet terror that the mountains could bring. Elias knew that something was coming. He didn't know what it was or when it would arrive, but he could feel it in the air. The wilderness had shifted, and it was no longer just a place of survival. It had become something darker, something that would test him in ways he had never imagined. The silence was shattered the following afternoon by a loud, persistent scratching at the cabin door. Elias shot to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced. Bears didn't scratch doors. Wolves didn't either. The noise was too deliberate, too purposeful. Whatever it wasn't natural. It was something else, something foreign to the wilderness he had come to know so well. He grabbed his rifle, his hand steady despite the rush of adrenaline that coursed through his veins. The scratching continued, the sound growing louder and more insistent. Elias moved cautiously to the door, peering through a narrow crack. The cabin, once a symbol of his strength and self-reliance, now felt fragile. His creation, once the perfect shelter against the harsh elements, felt vulnerable in the face of this unknown threat. The door rattled under another strike, and Elias's pulse quickened. Whatever was out there was no ordinary predator. It was methodical, calculating. He had learned to read the signs of nature in the mountains, but this felt different. The instincts he had honed for years were telling him that this wasn't just a storm or a bear, this was something personal. Elias crouched down, moving quietly to the gun port he had carved into the cabin's walls. He peered through the narrow slit, hoping to get a glimpse of whatever was outside. His eyes scanned the snow-covered ground, the thick forest, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of life. Yet the scratching continued, as though whatever it was, it knew he was there, inside. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his breath coming in slow, measured bursts. The scratching came again, louder this time, almost as if it were mocking him, testing him. Elias knew that his survival depended on his ability to stay calm, to think clearly. But this was unlike anything he had faced before. The mountains had always been a place of challenge, of struggle, but they had never felt so alive with malice. With a final heavy scrape, the sound stopped. For a moment, Elias stood perfectly still, waiting. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. The scratching had stopped, but something else had begun. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow, soft but distinct. Elias strained to listen, his senses heightened to the breaking point. Whoever, or whatever, was out there. It was moving, and it wasn't retreating. The minutes ticked by like hours. The crunching grew louder, closer. Elias's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't dare move. He had built this cabin to protect himself from the elements, from the wildlife. But this was different. The storm had passed, but the real storm had only just begun. The reckoning was here, and Elias had no idea what was waiting outside the walls of his snow-domed cabin. The minutes felt like hours as Elias remained frozen, his eyes fixed on the door, listening for any sign of movement outside. The silence that followed the crunching footsteps only deepened his unease. What kind of creature could be so deliberate, so patient? His mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. A bear? Wolves? Something else entirely? The wind outside had died down again, and the only sound that filled the cabin was the crackling of the fire. Elias's breath was shallow, his heart still pounding in his chest. Every creak of the timber seemed amplified in the stillness. Every shift of the snow against the cabin's walls felt like the first brush of danger. He kept his rifle close, his fingers twitching with the urge to move, to act, but he knew better than to rush in haste. The wilderness had a way of punishing the reckless. Slowly, he eased himself to the edge of the gun port, his eyes searching for any movement in the deep snow. But the world outside remained a pale blur of white. The footsteps had stopped, and the scratching at the door was gone. For a moment, Elias allowed himself to breathe again, but the tension in his chest refused to leave. There was something wrong, something unnatural about the way the silence had settled. He could feel it, pressing against the walls of his sanctuary. Suddenly, a deep guttural growl broke the stillness, so close that Elias's breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to see the creature to know what it was. It was too low to be a bear, too calculated. It was a mountain lion, large, hungry, and hunting. Elias's pulse quickened. He had encountered mountain lions before, but never this close, never with such focus. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood. Elias's instincts kicked in. He couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. He had to act. The lion was testing the door just as it would test prey, looking for weaknesses. But Elias wasn't prey. His mind flashed back to his days of building the snow dome, each choice made to outsmart the elements and predators. Without wasting another second, Elias opened the gun port just wide enough to fit the barrel of his rifle through, his hand steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. The lion growled one last time, louder and closer, before Elias took his shot. The sound of the rifle split the air, the blast ringing through the cabin like a crack of thunder. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, his heart still racing, the recoil of the gun still vibrating in his hands. For a moment the world seemed frozen in time, silent, suspended in the aftermath of the shot. He couldn't see the mountain lion, but he knew it wouldn't be moving anymore. He had heard the sickening thud of the shot landing. Elias stood still, his breath fogging the air in quick bursts as he strained to listen for any sign of life beyond the door. The storm had passed, but now there was a different kind of quiet. The heavy silence in the cabin was only broken by the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the walls as they settled in the cold. Elias's pulse slowly began to return to normal, but his mind remained alert. Even though the immediate danger had passed, the mountains had a way of making you feel like the danger was always lurking just beyond reach. He moved cautiously toward the door, his rifle still in hand, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation. The wind had died down completely, and the world outside appeared still, as though nothing had ever happened. But Elias knew better. The mountains were never truly still. The quiet after the storm was always the most dangerous part. When you least expected it, the wilderness could strike again. With careful movements, Elias opened the door, his eyes scanning the snow-covered ground for any sign of the lion. What he saw instead made his heart sink. The fresh tracks of the mountain lion led straight toward the cabin, and not far from the door, Elias spotted the lion's body, still, its thick fur now matted with blood. He knelt down, feeling the cold seep through his pants, inspecting the wound. The shot had been true, but it had been close, too close. He had barely survived his first test of this storm. Elias stood up, his legs stiff, as he surveyed the rest of the surrounding area. The mountains were vast, but he wasn't alone anymore, not in the way he had been. He knew that the wilderness, with its unpredictability, its dangers, and its sudden moments of relief, would always keep him on edge. But he had survived the storm, the mountain lion, and the harsh reality of isolation, and for now, that was enough. As Elias turned back toward the cabin, he realized something that had been nagging at him for days. The snow dome had provided him shelter against the elements. It had shielded him from the cold and the beasts of the mountain. But the true test hadn't been surviving the storm. It had been surviving his own mind. And in that moment, as the first rays of the setting sun cast a soft glow over the snow, Elias understood that it was his strength, not the cabin, that had gotten him through.